What would you do if at 20 years old you had nothing left to your name but $40 and the clothes on your back? That was the exact and terrible arithmetic facing Josephine Calloway in the spring of 1887, when her uncle, Reginald Calloway, stood in the doorway of the freight office her late father had built with his own hands and told her she was no longer welcome inside it. He said the business was his now, signed over in debts she had never seen and never signed, and that a woman had no place running wagons across the territory regardless. With $40 folded into her glove and a single carpetbag to her name, Josephine wandered into the sun-blistered town of Widow's Notch, Arizona Territory, and there, at a dust-choked auction yard behind the livery, she spent 35 of those dollars on something every sensible person in town called worthless: an abandoned desert supply convoy. 4 broken-down freight wagons and their moldering crates, left to rot after its owner vanished without explanation 2 years before. Folks laughed when she raised her hand to bid. They did not know that beneath the false bottom of the last crate in that convoy lay a ledger that would upend everything Widow's Notch believed about its own founding, and would give an entire community back something that had been stolen from it in silence for a decade. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calloway. If you're watching from a place that people have written off as finished, we'd love for you to tell us about it in the comments below, and if stories like hers move you the way they move us, we'd be so grateful if you'd follow or subscribe to our channel, so you never miss the next one. Josephine had been raised to believe that value was not always visible on the surface of a thing, and that lesson had been taught to her not in a schoolroom, but in the back room of her father's freight office in Independence, Missouri, where she had spent her childhood watching him sort through the returned and the damaged and the discarded. Thomas Calloway ran a modest but well-respected freighting company that supplied wagon trains heading west, and he had a peculiar habit that other freight men found foolish. He never threw anything away until he had turned it over in his hands at least 3 times. A crate with a cracked lid might still hold good nails. A bolt of water-stained canvas might patch a dozen smaller tears. A horse too old to pull a heavy load might still be sound enough to carry a child to school. Everybody wants to look at what's broke and call it finished, Josie, he used to tell her, tapping the brim of his hat back on his head as he worked. But broke ain't the same as worthless. You just got to be willing to look twice. Her mother had died delivering her, and so it was her father who raised her, who taught her to read a bill of lading before she could properly read a storybook, who taught her how to judge the honesty of a stranger by the way he loaded his wagon, and who taught her, above all, patience. The particular, unglamorous patience of someone willing to sit with an unsolved problem until it finally gave up its answer. She grew up strong-backed and clear-eyed, comfortable with grease under her fingernails and ledgers spread across her lap. And by the time she was 17, she was doing half the bookkeeping for Calloway Freight herself, catching errors that clerks twice her age had missed. Her father used to say she had an instinct for finding what other people overlooked, whether it was a discrepancy buried 3 columns deep in a ledger or a good wheel hiding under a layer of trail mud. It was, he told her once, the only inheritance that mattered. Because money could be taken from a person, but a trained eye could not. She loved him fiercely and uncomplicatedly, the way a daughter loves a father who has never once made her feel like a burden. And when consumption took him in the winter of 1886, she buried him beside her mother on a low hill outside Independence, and told herself that whatever came next, she would carry that inheritance forward, even if the business itself did not survive to pass to her. She did not yet know how quickly the vultures would begin circling, nor how close to home the first one would come from. The fall arrived with the particular cruelty of betrayal dressed up as family obligation, because it was her father's own younger brother, Reginald Calloway, who orchestrated it. Reginald had drifted in and out of Thomas's life for years, always with a new scheme, always needing a loan he rarely repaid. And Thomas had extended him credit and patience in equal measure out of a brother's stubborn loyalty. In the weeks after the funeral, while Josephine was still raw with grief, Reginald arrived from St. Louis with a folder of papers and a lawyer's practiced smile, explaining that their father had in his final months taken out loans against the business to cover Reginald's failed hardware venture, and that as co-signer and nearest male relation, Reginald now held controlling claim over Callaway Freight until the debts were settled. Josephine asked to see her father's signature on the loan papers and was told, coolly, that a grieving daughter's memory of her father's handwriting was hardly the standard the bank required. She asked the family lawyer, a man named Otis Pruitt, who had always seemed kind to her, and he only looked at his shoes and murmured that the paperwork appeared to be in order. She would learn much later, though not soon enough to save herself, that Pruitt had been paid handsomely to look away from certain irregularities, a lesson in how easily official-looking paper could be made to say almost anything if the right hands shaped it. Within 6 weeks, Reginald had sold off 2/3 of the company's rolling stock, kept the office and the good wagons for himself, and informed Josephine, with the particular gentleness men use when they want a thing to sound like mercy, that she was welcome to stay in independence and find work as a seamstress or a governess, but that freighting was no business for a woman alone. She left instead. She told herself it was pride, but it was something sturdier than pride. It was her father's own conviction that a person's worth was not decided by the men who happened to control the paperwork. She took what money remained to her name, $40 saved from her own small wages over the years that Reginald hadn't thought to ask about, and she boarded a westbound train with no particular destination beyond away, until a delay in the rail line stranded her in the Arizona Territory town of Widow's Notch, a sun-hammered crossroads settlement of perhaps 400 souls clustered around a spring-fed well that was, as she would soon learn, the very reason the town existed at all. Widow's Notch earned its name, the old-timers said, from a dispute so far in the past that no two versions of the story agreed. But what everyone agreed on was that the town survived on freight traffic passing between the mining camps to the north and the railhead to the south, and that 2 years prior, a respected independent freighter named Amos Whitfield had vanished during a supply run into the desert, along with his convoy of 4 wagons, never to be seen again. His wagons had eventually been found abandoned at the edge of a dry wash, the mules gone, the goods inside apparently untouched by bandits, which struck people as strange enough that the story calcified into local legend. Some said Whitfield had been swallowed by a flash flood. Others whispered about a curse on the wash itself, and nobody wanted the convoy badly enough to do more than let it sit rotting behind the livery, gathering a reputation as bad luck alongside its coating of dust. When the liveryman, a weary widower named Corwin Steeder, decided he needed the yard space and put the convoy up for a token auction, Josephine, newly arrived, nearly broke, and needing some way to make herself useful in a town where she had neither family nor reputation, found herself drawn to it the way her father would have been drawn to it, walking its length slowly, running a hand along the sun-cracked wood, noting that despite 2 years of neglect the wheel hubs were still sound, and the canvas covers, though faded, had no rot in them. The other bidders, 3 local men looking to strip it for scrap lumber, dropped out once the price crept past $20, unwilling to spend real money on a wagon train everyone considered cursed. Josephine paid $35 for all 4 wagons and their contents, drawing snorts of amusement from the yard, and spent her first night in Widow's Notch sleeping in the driver's seat of the lead wagon because she had no money left for a room. It was there, working by lantern light to inventory what she'd bought so she could decide what to sell. That she pried open the last crate in the last wagon, found its bottom oddly thick and uneven, and discovered, wedged beneath a false panel that had clearly been built into the crate on purpose, a leather-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the damp, along with a small tin box containing a set of keys she did not yet understand. The ledger, once she'd cleaned the desert dust from its cover and begun to read it by lantern light, revealed itself to be no ordinary freight record, but a private accounting book kept in Amos Whitfield's own careful hand, and what it recorded, in dates and figures spanning nearly 4 years, was a slow-motion theft being carried out against the town of Widow's Notch by its own most trusted citizen. The ledger tracked payments, land transfers, and water allotments connected to the very spring that fed the town well. And as Josephine worked through it night after night in the weeks that followed, cross-referencing entries against public notices she found at the land office, and against the memories of townspeople she carefully drew into conversation, a picture assembled itself with the same unhurried inevitability her father had taught her to expect from a well-kept set of books. A decade earlier, when Widow's Notch was newly platted, the spring and its surrounding acreage had been held in common trust for the town's use. Administered on paper by the Territorial Land Office, but managed locally by a committee of 3 founding citizens. Over the years, through a series of small, technically legal, and thoroughly dishonest maneuvers, quiet purchases of adjoining parcels, manipulated survey lines, water rights quietly reassigned on paper during a drought year when frightened homesteaders were persuaded to sign away shares they didn't understand they were losing. Nearly all effective control of the spring had been consolidated into the hands of one man, Silas Vane, the town's banker, its largest landholder, and by far its most publicly respected citizen, a man who sat on the church board and funded the schoolhouse roof, and was, in the estimation of nearly everyone in Widow's Notch, the very embodiment of frontier decency. Amos Whitfield, Josephine came to understand from the ledger's later entries, had been the one man in town with the freighting contacts and financial literacy to notice the pattern, having hauled goods for half the parties involved, and overheard enough loose talk in enough saloons to start quietly assembling proof, intending, one entry suggested, to bring his findings to the territorial marshal on his next supply run north. He never completed that run. The ledger's final entries grew hurried, almost frightened, noting that he believed he was being watched, and the very last page contained not figures, but a short, unsteady note. If anything should happen to me, let this book find honest hands, for the town deserves its water and its dignity both. Beneath that note, tucked into an inside pocket of the binding, Josephine found a hand-drawn map marking the location of a strongbox buried near the dry wash, where his wagons had eventually been found. And it was only then that the tin box of keys made sense to her. They were, she would later confirm, keys to that very strongbox. Keys Whitfield had hidden separately from the map so that no single discovery would give away everything at once. A final, careful precaution from a man who trusted almost no one by the end. Josephine did not act rashly, because her father had taught her that a claim without proof was worth exactly nothing, and she understood immediately that a friendless young woman arriving in town with wild accusations against its most beloved citizen would be laughed out of Widow's Notch before she finished her first sentence. Instead, she spent the following weeks doing the patient, unglamorous work of building a case, using the freight business itself as her cover. She began repairing and running Whitfield's old wagons for small local hauling jobs, earning just enough to eat and to establish herself as a legitimate, hard-working presence in town, all while quietly visiting the land office in the neighboring county seat to request copies of old survey filings, cross-checking names and dates against the ledger, and speaking gently with older homesteaders about the drought years, listening far more than she spoke. She found Amos Whitfield's strongbox exactly where the map indicated, buried beneath a cairn of sun-bleached stones at the edge of the wash. And inside it she found notarized copies of the original common trust deed for the spring, along with several of the fraudulent reassignment papers Vane had used, apparently kept by Whitfield as insurance, their forged signatures glaringly inconsistent when laid beside genuine ones she'd gathered from public records. It was during this quiet excavation that Silas Vane himself first took notice of her. Riding out one afternoon on the pretext of welcoming the town's newest small businesswoman, his manner warm and avuncular, his questions about her freighting venture just probing enough that Josephine understood, with a small cold chill, that he suspected she had found something in those wagons he cared very much about. From that point forward, the conflict sharpened. Vane used his considerable influence to make her life in Widow's Notch quietly difficult, calling in a note on her wagon repairs that Corwin Steeder had extended her, spreading gentle, deniable rumors about her character and her right to be running a freight operation alone, and eventually offering to simply buy the Convoy and all its contents from her outright for a suspiciously generous $200, a sum meant to make her disappear before she understood what she was holding. When she declined, his tone cooled considerably, and threats began arriving in less deniable forms. A shipment of her repaired wagon parts mysteriously delayed at the rail depot. A whispered suggestion to the one boarding house in town that renting a room to her might not be wise. And finally, a visit from a deputized associate of Vane's suggesting she'd be safer moving on from Widow's Notch before the desert around it grew any more dangerous for a woman traveling alone. Josephine understood she was running out of time, and that whatever she intended to do with what Amos Whitfield had left her, she would have to do it soon, publicly, and all at once, because a slow unveiling gave Vane too much room to bury the truth a second time the way he had buried it the first. She chose the town's quarterly water rights meeting as her moment, a public gathering held in the schoolhouse each season to review allotments from the spring. Normally a dull formality that Vane himself chaired without challenge. And she arrived with the ledger, the notarized deed copies, the forged reassignment papers, and, crucially, 3 of the older homesteaders she had spent weeks quietly earning the trust of, each willing to stand up and confirm, in their own words, the pressured circumstances under which they'd signed away their water shares during the drought years. When Vane, startled and visibly rattled at the sight of the ledger in her hands, attempted to dismiss her as a stranger, spreading dangerous falsehoods, Josephine did not raise her voice or make a single accusation she could not immediately support with paper, laying out the timeline with the same calm, methodical clarity her father had taught her to bring to any set of books. Letting the documents themselves carry the weight of the argument, while the assembled town listened in a silence that grew heavier with every entry she read aloud. The forged signatures, held up beside authentic ones from the land office, were damning in a way that required no further interpretation, and when one of the homesteaders, an old woman named Prudence Holloway, who had lost nearly all her water allotment 11 years prior and never understood why, stood and confirmed through tears that she recognized the very papers being described. The room's sympathy tipped decisively away from the banker who had spent a decade cultivating their trust. Vane's final, desperate gambit was to claim that even if the original arrangement had been irregular, the deeds now legally belonged to him after years of unchallenged possession. But Josephine, having anticipated exactly this argument, produced the original common trust deed Whitfield had preserved, notarized and dated years before any of Vane's reassignments, establishing beyond dispute that the spring had never legally left the town's collective ownership at all. Faced with a room full of neighbors who now understood precisely how they had been quietly robbed for a decade, and with a territorial marshal summoned by the schoolteacher during the meeting's most dramatic moments, Silas Vane's carefully constructed respectability collapsed within the space of a single evening. He was escorted from the schoolhouse to await formal charges of fraud and land theft, his considerable assets frozen pending an accounting that the townspeople, led by Josephine's own careful bookkeeping, would spend the following months untangling, discovering along the way that Vane's bank had been quietly skimming interest from town accounts for years, using methods disturbingly similar to those in Whitfield's ledger. What Josephine did next was, to her, the only conceivable course of action, though it stunned a town that had half expected the young woman who exposed the fraud to simply claim the recovered water rights and the considerable restitution due to her as Whitfield's rightful discoverer, and walk away wealthy. Instead, she petitioned the Territorial Land Office to formally restore the spring and its surrounding acreage to common trust exactly as it had originally been deeded, refusing any personal claim to the land itself. And she used only a modest finder's portion of the restitution fund, awarded to her by the reconstituted Water Committee over her own objections, who insisted she deserved something for the risk she'd taken to properly restore Amos Whitfield's Convoy and formally establish Callaway Freight Company as a legitimate local hauling business, the very inheritance her uncle had tried to strip from her 1,000 miles away. The remainder of the restitution went to the town itself, distributed among the homesteaders who had lost their shares, funding new irrigation channels that finally gave every family fair access to the spring rather than the trickle Vane's arrangement had left them, and a small stone marker was raised at the edge of the dry wash, at Josephine's quiet insistence, bearing Amos Whitfield's name and the words he had written at the end of his own ledger, that the town deserved its water and its dignity both. Silas Vane was convicted the following spring on charges of fraud and forgery, stripped of his remaining assets to help fund the town's recovery, and though some in Widow's Notch felt the sentence too lenient for 10 years of quiet theft, there was a particular, unhurried justice in watching a man who had spent a decade being praised for generosity finally forced to surrender everything he had, accumulated through deceit, brought low not by violence or vengeance, but by the same patient, careful attention to detail he had always assumed no one would think to apply to him. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a young woman of 20 years standing in a dusty auction yard with $40 to her name, spending 35 of them on 4 broken wagons that the whole town had already decided were worthless and cursed. Josephine Callaway never doubted, not truly, that there was value in what others had discarded, because her father had spent a lifetime teaching her to look twice at broken things before calling them finished. And it was that same patient, unglamorous willingness to sit with an unsolved problem that let her recognize Amos Whitfield's final desperate act of hope for exactly what it was. A message in a bottle, cast into the desert, waiting for someone honest enough to find it and brave enough to finish what he'd started. She had lost her father's business to a man who mistook cruelty for cleverness, and she found, in the very last place anyone expected, a way to give an entire community back something that had been quietly stolen from it for 10 long years. The town that once laughed at her foolish purchase came, in time, to understand that the only foolish thing that spring had ever done was underestimate her. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and with Josephine's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often hold more value than anyone around them realizes. We'd love to know, has there ever been a moment in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us about it in the comments below, and if you haven't already, Please consider following or subscribing to our channel so you never miss the next story like this one. Until next time, stay close.